The year is 1838. A Cherokee man named Tolly stands barefoot in the frozen mud of what used to be his family's land in the mountains of present-day North Carolina and Georgia. His hands are bound behind his back with rope that has already cut into his wrists deep enough to leave marks that would never fully heal. Around him, United States Army soldiers on horseback move in slow circles, their breath visible in the cold morning air. His wife is somewhere behind him. He cannot turn to see her. One of the soldiers dismounts, walks toward him, and without a word, raises a leather strap and brings it down across his back. Not because Tolly had attacked anyone, not because he had stolen anything, but because he had hesitated, because he had slowed down, because his legs were failing him on the march that the United States government had decided would relocate his entire people from their ancestral homeland to a land they had never seen, hundreds of miles to the west. And here's what almost nobody tells you. This moment, this exact kind of moment, was not unique. It was not isolated. It was one scene inside a much larger story that lasted for centuries, stretched across an entire continent, and touched the lives of millions of people on both sides of an invisible line that kept moving west every single decade. What you're about to hear is not comfortable. It is not simple. It is not the version they showed you in school. This is what it was actually like to live in the space between the world of the Native American tribes and the world of the white colonizers, and the answer is far worse than most people are willing to admit. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, and go to the comments and write which city you're watching this video from.
Indigenous West Stories.
Before a single shot was ever fired, before a single treaty was ever broken, before a single village was ever burned to the ground, something invisible and unstoppable had already arrived on the shores of North America. The Europeans who came across the Atlantic in the 1500s and 1600s brought with them diseases that the indigenous peoples of this continent had never encountered in their entire history. Smallpox, influenza, measles, typhus. These were illnesses that many Europeans had some degree of immunity to because their populations had been living with them for generations. The native tribes had none. Their immune systems had no reference point, no defense, no historical memory of how to fight these pathogens. The result was catastrophic in ways that are almost impossible to fully comprehend even today. Entire communities collapsed before they had any meaningful contact with European settlers. Historians and epidemiologists who have studied this period estimate that in some regions, between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population died from disease alone. Not from war, not from conquest, from invisible particles carried on, the breath of people who had just arrived and did not even know they were carrying death with them. There are recorded cases of explorers arriving at villages along the eastern coast and finding nothing but empty houses and bones. Communities that had thrived for thousands of years simply ceased to exist. And this happened again and again and again as the frontier moved west, decades and sometimes centuries ahead of the settlers themselves. With disease traveling along trade routes and river systems and wiping out populations before colonizers even arrived to claim the land. The tragedy of this cannot be overstated. Millions of people died without ever understanding what was killing them, without ever knowing who these newcomers were, without ever having the chance to fight back or flee or negotiate. They simply vanished. For those who survived the diseases, the world they woke up into every morning was one defined by constant uncertainty and the ever-present possibility of violence. And this violence was not one-directional. This is one of the things that gets either oversimplified or completely erased, depending on who is telling the story. The reality is that attacks happened on both sides, retaliations happened on both sides, and the cycle of violence fed itself for generations in ways that made it nearly impossible to find solid ground. A colonial settlement on the edge of the frontier might be attacked at night by a group of warriors from a nearby tribe who had seen their hunting lands encroached upon, their game depleted, their people pushed further and further from the territory they had occupied for centuries. Houses would burn, people would die, and then the colonial militia would ride out in response and attack a village, often not the same village that had launched the original raid, but whatever indigenous community was closest and most vulnerable. More houses would burn, more people would die, and the men who survived that attack would gather and plan their own response. The cycle was self-perpetuating and devastating, and it consumed ordinary people on both sides who often had very little say in the decisions that had set these events in motion. Scalping, which has become one of the most iconic and misunderstood symbols of this era, is a perfect example of how complex and morally ambiguous this history truly is. The practice did exist among some native tribes before European contact, and it carried specific cultural and spiritual meaning within those traditions. But what almost never gets mentioned is that European colonizers adopted the practice as well, and in several instances, colonial governments institutionalized it in ways that are genuinely shocking to read about today. There are documented cases of colonial authorities offering cash payments, what were called bounties, for the scalps of native men, women, and sometimes children. In some periods and some regions, these bounties were official government policy. The scalp became a proof of killing, a currency of genocide, collected and exchanged like a commodity. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, Pennsylvania, and other colonial governments all have documented histories of scalp bounties at various points during conflicts in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is not a fringe historical claim. It is documented in colonial records, and yet it rarely appears in the standard narrative because it complicates the clean story that many people prefer to tell about this period. Alongside the violence of direct combat and raiding, there existed another kind of violence that was quieter, but no less brutal. The forced labor of indigenous people was not as systematically organized in North America as it was in Central and South America under Spanish colonial rule, but it existed. In certain colonial contexts, particularly during periods of conflict, when indigenous individuals were captured as prisoners of war, those individuals could be put to work. They built structures, transported goods, cleared land, performed the kinds of heavy physical labor that the colonial economy depended upon. And in some of these situations, physical punishment was used as a tool of control. This is where the whip enters the story, and it enters quietly, without the fanfare or the detailed historical documentation that surrounds the much larger system of African enslavement that was operating simultaneously in the same colonies. The records are incomplete. The victims often had no voice in the documents that survived. But there are accounts, missionary records, legal documents, personal journals that describe indigenous individuals being struck, beaten, flogged, as a means of discipline or coercion. It was not the dominant system, it was not universal, but it happened and almost nobody talks about it, and the silence around it is itself a kind of historical violence, an erasure of the suffering of people who were already being erased in every other way. The psychological dimension of this era is something that historians have increasingly paid attention to in recent decades, and it reveals a layer of deliberate cruelty that goes beyond simple military conflict. Fear was a weapon, deployed intentionally by both sides, but used with particular effectiveness by colonial militaries and governments, because they had the institutional power and the resources to make that fear systematic. There are accounts of deliberate displays of violence designed to break the spirit of indigenous communities, to convince them that resistance was futile and surrender was the only rational option. Bodies were displayed, villages were burned, not because the colonizers needed the land immediately, but because the act of burning sent a message. The destruction of food stores during winter months was a calculated strategy. If you could not feed your people through the coldest months, you could not fight in the spring. Starvation was used as a weapon of war in ways that killed just as effectively as any rifle. And the psychological toll of watching your entire world be dismantled piece by piece, your land taken, your food supply destroyed, your relatives dead from diseases you did not understand, your children captured or taken to schools that would erase everything they were. This was a form of suffering that does not show up on any battlefield casualty list, but was real and devastating and lasted for generations. The capture of children from both sides of this conflict is a chapter that reveals the full strangeness and tragedy of this period. Some native tribes had a long tradition of adopting captives, including children taken from enemy groups or from colonial settlements, and integrating them into the tribal community. This was not understood or accepted by European colonizers as a legitimate cultural practice. To them, it was abduction, and the fear of having a child taken and raised as a member of a native tribe was one of the defining anxieties of frontier life for colonial families. At the same time, the capture and removal of indigenous children was being carried out on a massive and institutionalized scale by the colonial governments and later by the United States federal government. Children were taken from their families and placed in government-run boarding schools specifically designed to destroy their cultural identity. Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879, described the mission of these schools with a phrase that has become one of the most infamous in American history: kill the Indian, save the man. The philosophy was explicit. The goal was not education in any meaningful sense, it was erasure. Children were forbidden to speak their languages. Their traditional clothing was replaced with uniform. Their hair, which carried deep cultural and spiritual significance for many tribes, was cut off. Their names were replaced with English names. Their connection to their families, their communities, their traditions, their entire sense of who they were was systematically dismantled in the name of civilization. Many of these children never recovered. Many never returned home. Many returned to communities they no longer recognized and were recognized by no one. Strangers in the land of their ancestors, stripped of every tool they would have needed to belong anywhere at all. Alliances and treaties form another layer of this history that is essential to understand, because the pattern of how they worked reveals something fundamental about the power dynamic of the entire era. When colonial settlers, or later the United States government, needed something, they were willing to negotiate. They would sit with tribal leaders, sign documents, exchange gifts, make promises. And these promises were real in the sense that they were written down and formalized. They carried the weight of law, at least on paper. But the moment the strategic situation changed, the moment the settlers wanted more land or more resources, or the political wind shifted in Washington, those treaties were renegotiated under duress, reinterpreted to mean something different than what had been agreed upon, or simply ignored entirely. The United States government signed hundreds of treaties with indigenous nations over the course of its history. The vast majority of those treaties were broken in whole or in part by the United States. This is not a matter of historical debate. It is documented in the federal government's own records. The result was a cycle of betrayal that made genuine peace nearly impossible. Every time a tribe had chosen negotiation over resistance, had decided to trust the promises being made across a table, they found that trust was used against them, and every betrayal made the next negotiation more fraught, more desperate, more certain to collapse. The forced relocations that resulted from these broken promises represent some of the darkest chapters of this entire era. The Trail of Tears is the most famous example because it is large enough and well documented enough to be impossible to completely ignore, though many American history textbooks still treat it as a footnote rather than a central event. In the 1830s, the United States government forced the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations to leave their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States and march hundreds of miles to designated territory in what is now Oklahoma. The conditions of these marches were brutal. People walked in the middle of winter. They were inadequately clothed and fed. Disease spread through the groups as they moved. Elderly individuals and young adults alike collapsed and died on the road. Estimates of the death toll on the Cherokee portion of the march alone range from 4,000 to 8,000 people out of a total population of roughly 16,000 who were removed. They died from cold, from hunger, from dysentery, from despair. Tzali, the man whose story opened this account, was real. His resistance during the removal became a symbol, and his execution at the hands of the army was demanded by the government as a condition for allowing a small remnant of the Cherokee to remain in North Carolina. He walked to his death knowingly, reportedly telling the soldiers that he preferred being shot to being taken west. He was shot by Cherokee men because the government insisted that Cherokee hands carry out the sentence, one final cruelty layered on top of all the others. The destruction of the buffalo herds in the mid to late 19th century represents a form of warfare that was environmental and economic rather than military, but was no less devastating for the tribes of the Great Plains. Tens of millions of bison had roamed the plains for thousands of years. They were the foundation of the economy, the diet, the spiritual life, and the material culture of dozens of tribes. The hide hunters came with rifles capable of killing animals at a distance that made mass slaughter possible. And within a few decades, they had reduced the bison population from somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals to fewer than 1,000. This was not an accident. There were voices within the United States military and government who understood clearly that eliminating the bison would eliminate the independence of the Plains tribes more effectively than any military campaign. General Philip Sheridan said as much explicitly, arguing that the hide hunters were doing more to solve the native problem than the entire army had managed in 30 years. The tribes who had built their entire way of life around the bison found themselves facing starvation as the herds vanished. They had no alternative food supply. Their lands had been taken. The game that might have supplemented their diet was gone. Hunger became a permanent feature of reservation life, used not just as a side effect of policy, but as a tool of submission. And then, overlaying all of this was the slow and grinding destruction of language, of ceremony, of memory itself. The boarding school system that erased children's names and cut their hair was just the most visible mechanism of a much broader cultural assault. Indigenous people were told that their languages were primitive, that their spiritual practices were superstition, that their ways of organizing society were inferior. Missionaries came to convert. Government agents came to assimilate. Anthropologists came to observe and catalog what was being destroyed as if watching a controlled experiment. And the people caught in the middle of all of this were human beings with complex inner lives and deep histories and sophisticated knowledge of the land they lived on, reduced in the eyes of the colonizing power to problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. The cumulative weight of disease, violence, displacement, starvation, cultural destruction, and psychological warfare across 3 centuries created a trauma that did not end when the frontier officially closed in 1890. It was inherited. It passed from generation to generation in the form of broken families, lost languages, interrupted traditions, communities rebuilt on the ruins of what had existed before. And most of the people who benefited from what was taken have never had to think very hard about where it came from or what it cost. This is not ancient history. It is recent enough that there are elders alive today who attended those boarding schools and had their hair cut off and their names changed. It is recent enough that the legal battles over treaty rights and land and resources are still being fought in American courts. It is recent enough that the languages that were almost destroyed are still being painstakingly recovered by communities that refuse to let them disappear entirely. The story of what happened between the native peoples of North America and the European colonizers and their descendants is not a story with a clean ending or a satisfying moral. It is a story about what human beings do to each other when power is unequal and land is valuable, and difference is treated as justification for cruelty. It is a story about the distance between the words people use to describe themselves and the actions they actually take. And it is a story that is not finished, because the consequences of what happened are still shaping the lives of millions of people today, on both sides of that invisible line that kept moving west century after century until there was nowhere left to go.